Welcome to the third in our series of short videos on essay writing for Logos One. We acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which our campuses are built. The topic of this short video is on paragraph planning, and we see a wall here. The reason is that paragraphs are the building blocks of essays. Now, when you build a wall, you don't divide it into bricks afterwards. You build from those bricks, and ideally you choose bricks which are even to create a strong and attractive looking wall. And I would recommend you to do the same in your essay writing. In other words, to plan your paragraphs before you start writing. Of course, it's possible to revise afterwards. Even when you build a wall, you might need to add an extra row, for example. But no one starts building a wall without a plan. And I believe that the same should apply to essay writing. So, what size bricks are you going to choose, essentially? There's no absolute answer to that, but I'm going to suggest that your paragraphs should be somewhere like 5 or 6 sentences long. Not tiny little ones where you can't explain anything, or long rambling ones where you go off the point. This is, the Goldilocks zone of paragraph length, in my view. Now, you'll see examples of much longer paragraphs, and even in some of the examples of model essays, you'll see that someone's written longer paragraphs. It's not a dogmatic thing, okay? It's just a practical thing. It's easier for you to write effective essays if you keep the paragraph length down. It's a little bit like juggling, if you are given 3 balls, with a bit of practice you can juggle. If you add an extra ball, it's very likely they're going to end up on the floor because you've just got too much to concentrate on. So keep the length reasonably short. What that ends up meaning is that your paragraphs are somewhere around 140 to 160 words long. It's just because sentences tend to be between 20 and 30 words long on average. So you've got 1,500 words, and what that means is that you're likely to write about 10 paragraphs. Knowing that in advance is very useful for you because it means you can plan the content and purpose of your paragraphs in advance, and it makes it easier to write. So the next step really is just to distribute your 10 paragraphs among the different parts of the essay. Now, the 2 obvious paragraphs that speak for themselves are an introduction and a conclusion. So that now brings your paragraph total down to 8. So you've got 2 parts of the essay, part 1 and part 2, and you're given a word length for them, and it indicates really that part 1 is either a bit shorter than part 2 or the same length. So knowing that you've got about 8 paragraphs means that for part 1 you can plan for 3 or 4, and then for part 2 if you're going to write 3 for part 1, that gives you 5 for part 2. But if you've written 4 for part 1, well, you've only got 4 left, so that's how it's going to be. So that's the kind of paragraph framework that you're working with. So the question now is how you can use your paragraph budget to answer the question. So for part 1, you're asked to summarize the ideas in the text. Okay, so you're asked to explain what Socrates thought philosophy was and why he greatly esteemed philosophy, for example. Or you're asked to explain what Aristotle's arguments were for what makes a government right, okay, etc. So you need to make essentially 3 or 4 points summarizing that argument. Each of those is a single paragraph, and we've already established you've got 3 or 4. So if we go to topic 2, which is about Gensler's work, you're asked to explain the problems that he argues are in cultural relativism and moral subjectivity. So, you know, if you deal with those separately, you would write 1 or 2 paragraphs about each one, like this. I haven't read the book, so I don't know if that's the best way to go about it. It could be that, you know, instead of that, you pick out 3 problems that he mentions with both. Fine. But the principle is that you organize your ideas around the 3 or 4 paragraphs that you've got. And then moving on to part 2, that's where you need to take sides. You need to take a position for or against that view that you've just summarized. Now for topic 2, you are actually reminded that you need to also introduce an alternative view on the nature of ethics. So for example, you could do that in the next paragraph. But remember that you are focusing on, you know, the text, Gensler's text. So having introduced this alternative view, you're then going to sort of say what makes it similar or different to Gensler's. Now, whether you can do that in a single paragraph or whether you need 2, I don't know. Don't go on and on in a single paragraph, obviously. If you find that you need more, then separate it and, for example, go on to a second paragraph to talk about the similarities and differences. You need to concentrate on your point of view for or against. Okay, so don't get misled into just summarizing and talking about that other point of view. Why do you either prefer Gensler's argument or you think it's weaker than the other? You need 2 or 3 different arguments to support your point of view. One of those might be applying this argument, this point of view, to a particular context, for example, to an issue in modern Australia. That could be one way of pointing out the strengths or weaknesses in the argument. But remember, you need to take sides, for or against. Don't get confused. So, we're done with our paragraph planning. If you want to join me again, the next one will be looking at the structure of your introduction. So maybe see you again.